It is said that in the days when the roads of Persia still carried the slow breath of caravans and the dust of forgotten journeys, there existed a small tea-house between two unnamed towns, neither marked clearly on any map, yet known quietly among travelers who spoke little and observed much, and it was here, in this place of worn wooden beams and faded blue tiles, that dervish Yunis arrived one evening as the sun leaned low over the horizon, like a tired eye closing upon the world. And the old narrator of this tale once heard from a merchant of Kashan that Yunis did not walk like other men, but moved as though he was always departing even in arrival, carrying nothing but a cloth bundle and the silence of years that had no need of words. And when he entered the tea-house, the air itself seemed to pause, not in wonder but in recognition, as if the walls had seen many such souls before, and knew better than to speak of them aloud. For this was a place where no one asked where another had come from, nor what weight they carried behind their eyes, and perhaps that was the only reason men returned there at all. The tea-house keeper, an old man, with hands like cracked earth and a face shaped by patience rather than time, simply poured tea into small glass cups without asking for names. For it was the custom of this place that identity was something left at the door like muddy shoes, and Yunis sat near the corner where the lantern light softened into amber shadow. And he did not speak, nor did he look around in curiosity, but instead watched the steam rising from his tea as though it contained a language older than speech itself. And nearby sat others, a weary silk trader, a young scribe with ink-stained fingers, a widow whose silence had become her companion, and a musician who carried a lute but did not play it that night. And all of them, though different in age and story, shared one unspoken agreement, that the past would not be summoned here, for the past once spoken tends to demand continuation. The night deepened slowly, and outside the wind moved through the narrow streets carrying the scent of distant rain and dry earth, and it is said that Yunis, though he said nothing, listened more deeply than others, spoke not to words but to the pauses between them, as if silence itself was a river, carrying truths too delicate for language. And the old men who later remembered that evening would say that he had a way of sitting that made others remember things they had long buried, not through force but through presence alone, like a mirror that does not judge, yet cannot be avoided. At one point the silk trader attempted a small remark about the weather, then stopped mid-sentence and smiled faintly, as if realizing that even such harmless bridges toward conversation were unnecessary here. And the scribe closed his ink bottle without writing a single line, for he later confessed that he felt any written word might disturb something fragile in the air. And the widow simply stared into her tea, as though seeing not the drink but the memory of hands that once held hers in another life. She no longer claimed, and Yunis, still silent, lifted his cup only once, as if acknowledging not the tea, but the moment itself, and in that gesture there was neither sadness nor joy, only acceptance, which in such places is rarer than either. Hours passed in this manner, not marked by clocks, but by the gradual softening of human tension, until even the musician's fingers began to rest more naturally upon his instrument, though he still did not play, as if sound would have been an intrusion upon a sacred agreement. And the tea-house keeper refilled cups with a rhythm that seemed older than habit, something inherited perhaps from generations who understood that hospitality is not in words, but in allowing another's silence to remain unbroken. It was then that Yunis finally looked up, not at anyone in particular, but at the room as a whole. And those who noticed later swore that in that brief moment it was as if he recognized each person, not by who they were but by what they had lost, though he gave no sign of judgment, only a quiet awareness that softened rather than pierced. And then he returned his gaze to his tea as if nothing had occurred at all, and the night continued. Outside, a distant call to prayer drifted faintly from a mosque beyond the alleyways, not loud enough to command attention, but sufficient to remind the soul of its own smallness. And within the tea-house no one moved to respond, not out of neglect, but because each person was already engaged in a different kind of prayer, one without words, one that asks nothing and expects nothing. And it is said that Yunis remained there until the oil in the lamps began to thin, and the shadows grew long and tired. And when he finally stood, he did so without ceremony, without farewell, and without leaving behind any explanation of his presence, as though he had merely been a thought the room briefly held and then released. And so ends what is remembered of his first evening in the tea-house, where no one spoke of their past. It is said that the following evening the tea-house appeared unchanged to the passing eye, yet those who had been there before felt a subtle difference, as though the air itself had learned something it did not wish to repeat aloud, and dervish Yunis returned at the same hour when the light begins to lose its certainty, when day and night exchanged their final glances without urgency, and again he took his place in the same corner as if he had never left it. And again no one asked him where he had been in the hours between, for in such a place absence is not considered a question, but a natural extension of presence. The silk trader was there again, though his eyes carried a heavier quiet than before. The scribe had returned with fresh ink, but still no words written. The widow sat closer to the window where the glass held faint reflections of those inside, and the musician now held his lute more openly, though still with hesitation, as if waiting for permission, not from others, but from something within himself that had not yet agreed to speak. Yunis entered without disturbance, and the old keeper poured tea, as always, but it is said that the steam that rose from the cups that night seemed slower, as if reluctant to dissolve into the air too quickly. And perhaps it was only imagination, or perhaps it was the effect of human attention when it becomes too still and too aware of itself. At one point, the silk trader broke the silence again, but this time not with words about weather or trade, but with a simple observation that the road beyond the town had been unusually empty. And as soon as he spoke, he seemed to regret having given shape to something that had previously been harmless in its vagueness. Yet no one responded, not because they disapproved, but because response would have required continuation, and continuation is a kind of promise that many in that room were no longer willing to make. The scribe, however, did something unexpected. He placed his inked pen on the table without using it, and instead began to trace invisible lines with his finger upon the wood, as if writing something that did not wish to become permanent. And when the widow noticed this, she did not look away as she usually did, but instead watched his hand, as though it reminded her of something she had once known in another life that never fully formed. And the musician, perhaps moved by nothing more than the accumulation of stillness, finally plucked a single string, not as music, but as a question posed gently into the room. And the sound did not grow into a melody, but dissolved almost immediately into silence again. Yet somehow, the silence after it felt different, more aware of its own existence. Yunis did not react outwardly, but those who observed closely said his gaze softened slightly, not in approval or disapproval, but in recognition of something ordinary and human, attempting, however, cautiously to return to itself. And it is said that in that moment the tea-house did not feel like a place of escape, but rather a place of suspension, where lives are not erased but simply set down for a while beside the cup of tea. Later that night, as oil lamps burned lower and the edges of the room blurred into indistinct shadow, the widow finally spoke, though not to anyone in particular, saying only that people carry their memories as if they are necessary organs, and then she fell silent again, as if surprised by her own voice, and no one responded. Yet the silence that followed was not heavy, but strangely gentle, as if her words had been accepted without need for agreement. Yunis then shifted slightly in his seat, not as a gesture of attention, but as one who adjusts himself to the passing of something important yet unannounced. And for a brief moment he looked toward the window where darkness had fully gathered outside, and it is said that those who followed his gaze felt not fear, but a quiet awareness of time itself moving without asking permission. When he eventually stood again, there was no signal that departure was near, no farewell, no preparation, only the natural completion of presence, and he left the tea-house as he had entered it, yet without altering the room, except in the way one alters a memory that will later be remembered, differently than it was lived, and the others remained longer than usual that night, not because they wished to stay, but because leaving felt temporarily unnecessary, as if something within them had not yet finished listening. It is said that on the third evening, rain came softly over the roads leading to the tea-house, not the kind of rain that demands attention, but the kind that arrives like memory itself, quietly and without announcement. And the earth outside darkened into a deeper shade of brown, as if it had been listening all along, and was now absorbing what had been spoken in silence the nights before. And dervish Yunis arrived with the dampness of the road upon his cloak, though he made no attempt to brush it away, as if even the rain had the right to remain with him for a while. Inside, the tea-house felt warmer than before, or perhaps it was only the contrast of the cold air outside, yet those who sat within spoke even less than on previous nights, not out of discipline, but because something about continuity had begun to feel unnecessary. as if words themselves had slowly realized they were not required to hold the room together. The keeper served tea as always, but his movements were slower, more deliberate, like a man who has begun to understand that repetition is not habit but reverence when done long enough, and Yunis took his place again in the corner, though this time he did not immediately look into his cup, but instead let his gaze rest upon the others, not searching them, not judging them, but simply acknowledging them as one acknowledges fellow travelers who will not be seen again in the same form, even if they remain seated in the same room. The silk trader did not speak at all that night, and his silence seemed no longer heavy, but resolved, as if something within him had finally been placed down after long carrying. The scribe had closed his ink entirely, and placed it away as though deciding that not every moment requires preservation. The widow sat with her hands folded in her lap instead of holding her cup, and the musician for the first time rested his lute fully against the table without touching it at all, as if it had finally become part of the room rather than an object awaiting permission. Yunis then did something he had not done before in this place. He rose slowly and walked toward the center of the room, not with intention of performance or declaration, but as one who simply changes position within a shared silence. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet, not carrying authority, but carrying weight in the way distant bells carry sound through fog. And it is said that he did not speak of himself, nor of others, but only said that every person arrives at places where their past can no longer follow them in the same form, and that such places are rare not because they are hidden, but because people do not recognize them when they arrive. No one responded yet. The room felt as if it had answered internally, and the rain outside grew slightly stronger for a brief moment, tapping against the wooden beams like a gentle reminder that the world beyond still existed, still moved, still continued its own quiet rhythm. The widow then stood, not in haste, but with a kind of acceptance that required no explanation, and she placed a small coin upon the table, not as payment but as acknowledgment, though for what it was unclear even to her, and the keeper did not move to take it immediately, as if understanding that some offerings are not meant to be collected at once. Yunis returned to his corner for the last time that night, and when he sat he did not drink his tea, but simply held the cup in both hands, as if feeling its warmth as something shared rather than consumed, and it is said that in that final hour, no one in the tea-house felt the need to speak even inwardly, for even thought had softened into something quieter than thought, something closer to presence. When dawn approached, not suddenly, but gradually, as it always does even when unnoticed, Yunis stood once more, and this time none of the others watched him directly, not out of indifference, but because looking felt unnecessary, as if departure was not an event but a natural folding of space, and he left the tea-house without turning back, and the door closed behind him with the same sound it always made, yet for those who remained it sounded slightly more final than before, though nothing in the world outside had changed. It is said that after that night the tea-house continued to exist, as it always had, serving travelers, pouring tea, holding silence. Yet those who had once sat there together never spoke again of what had occurred, not because they forgot, but because there was nothing left to add. And dervish Yunis was seen on the road beyond the town, in later years, by some who passed him briefly, always walking, always leaving, always arriving elsewhere without announcement. And the old men of Shiraz would say that he was not a man who belonged to places, but a man through whom places briefly learned how to be still. And so ends the tale of the tea-house, where no one spoke of their past, and yet somehow everything unspoken was understood.